ladies and gentlemen, let me start by sharing with you what happened. Somebody called our client and he said, I demand to exercise my rights under the GDPR in Singapore. So we said, I'm sorry you can't in PDPA, and said, no, I demand to do it. I'm a German citizen. So we all had to react, and we gently told him and led him to the regulator's website, which shows the extraterritorial scope of when GDPR will actually apply. Okay, so what am I getting at? A lot of lawyers think that just because you comply with GDPR, because that's the gold standard, means you're compliant with the local laws. So what I'd like to do here is to take you through the amendments of the Singapore PDPA. It was passed in Parliament in 2012, and in 2021, they amended the data protection law to align it with international standards. For example, GDPR is one of them, yeah? But the focus was on demonstrating accountability, consumer autonomy, data use and data innovation. That's something that we're going to be looking at. And if you look at this from a common sense approach, we were taught that the revised consent framework would apply to Article 7, but that's your conditions for consent. But guess what? It wasn't that. Our consent was simple. It was consent by conduct. Can you imagine? It's deemed consent, so you got your express consent. So now you got consent by conduct, which means that whatever you do voluntarily speaking is deemed consent. Then there's consent by contractual necessity, which is equivalent to your performance of a contract, yeah, under your lawful basis. And the last one was, is consent by notification, which should be equivalent to the e-privacy directive, where you have your first-party sale. There's no opt-in. You give a stipulated period. You can opt out anytime. So you can see some of the differences here, right? So it's not as strict as the Article 7 in this case. We got data portability. We got enhanced rules for telemarketing, similar to the telephone preference service. It used to be a criminal offense. Now they will slap a fine on you, which I'm going to elaborate very quickly. There's the accountability principle, which I won't elaborate. And there's the data breach notification, which is 3 calendar days. I don't know why Singapore call it 3 calendar days, which is 72 hours. Okay? I won't go into mechanics because we don't have time. I want to talk about the enhanced penalties. So if we use that as a backdrop, ladies and gentlemen, before I close off, you could see that in Singapore, the focus is on consumer rights. So I'd like to take you back to the digital economy. It's about building trust, confidence, so that we could do the e-commerce and enjoy that intra-trade within ASEAN. And in Singapore, it only covers the private sector. It's not a comprehensive law. So the private sector is where the law will, the PDPA, we call it the Personal Data Protection Act, will cover the private sector because the government sector has got its own laws. So Singapore will never have that. And you can guess from an adequacy perspective, we probably won't meet it, okay? So if you take a look, you will notice that the lawful basis is different. Ours is always consent first. Now, if you try to understand why is it consent first, you have to pull the lens back to look at the digital economy because it's consent-based. So in the following slides, you will see that a lot of the countries will be consent first and then the rest. In Singapore, we don't have a sensitive data category. We only have the government ID card. So you see the differences here? And I just talked about the deemed consent mechanism, which is new. Yeah. Now, you will notice that any country, especially Singapore, that focuses on consumer rights, the rights of the individual is very little. Now, if you take a look at the GDPR, you have all your rights. In Singapore, we only have the right to access, the right to correct, the new data portability, so the rights are very limited. DPN, as you can see, stands for data breach notification. And I'd like just to very quickly close off by looking at the fines. It's 10% of annual turnover or 1 million, whichever is higher. So let's use that. Now, for those of you who are operating in our part of the world, you have to remember that the regional HQs are in Singapore, right? So what we did was we compiled all of the enforcement cases, and you could see that very quickly the numbers that you see are the number of enforcement cases versus the number. So you can see in 2019, it was 1.64 million. We had the biggest breach with SingHealth. Our Prime Minister's data was put on, as you know, was hacked. So there was a lot of worldwide news. COVID struck, the numbers are there, but I'd like to draw your attention, if you're operating our part of the world, the average fines are going up So it's going to be about 40 to 50K per fine. So they are very particular, right? So that is the backdrop. So if I could very quickly close off, you see the key differences. The framing that I like to share with everyone is, remember, the focus, a lot of it is on the digital economy, right? Private sector, lawful basis is always consent first, and then the rest are exceptions. You try to map them to the legal basis, Article 6. Look at this enforcement trends. It's going to continue. So if you are operating in our part of the world, you could get into trouble. You get what we call the love letter from the regulator. They send you a love letter, and that's where they will demand, and you have lots of issues, yeah, I won't go through. There's a shortage of data protection officers. If you are DPO, you are in hot demand because the entire ASEAN region requires a DPO, and Singapore is a mandatory appointment. We do not apply the GDPR way of appointing a DPO, and we are now seeing data protection to data governance. Singapore is focused a lot on AI. There's a report now, Singapore is number 3. First, as you know, would be the US, followed by China, followed by Singapore, and then the UK. So the data governance part is going to be a key part, and we are now looking at, Singapore has introduced what is called an AI governance framework. They were one of the first in the world, but they have not introduced an AI law yet. So the EU one will be the first, and they've created something called the AI Verified Foundation with Google, with Microsoft, with IBM, in an effort to enable testing of AI models.